All right. Wow, what a nice group. Thank you for coming, everyone. Welcome to our program tonight, McFarland's Railroad History, the events, people, and businesses that shaped our community. It's my pleasure to introduce Ron Larson, our speaker tonight. Ron is a lifelong resident of McFarland. He was a member of the McFarland Historical Society for 15 years, 9 as president. Ron is a member of the McFarland Landmarks Commission since its founding in the early 1990s. He's been a librarian at Madison Newspapers for many years, at the Wisconsin Historical Society. He taught at the UW Library School. He has many publications, many of which are up here. If you're interested, some of them are available to check out. A few of them are reference only, but you can look at them in our McFarland Historical Room. And with that, I guess I'll let Ron go ahead. We really appreciate having you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kelly, and thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. It's really a pleasure to see so many people interested in McFarland's railroad history. And most of you probably know that the old story of William McFarland, and where he worked for the railroad, and then he was offered the job to come here, buy 160 acres, and build a depot, and name the town and the depot after him. And that's pretty much what we all have heard over the years. And I'm curious, though, what led up to that offer to William McFarland by the railroad? What were the events leading up to 1856? And why did the railroad come through here? Why did it come through this area? When it was coming from Milwaukee to Madison, this isn't exactly on the east-west line between those two cities. So what were the events that led to the railroad coming through this area? And then I'll also talk about some of the people that were involved in the businesses in McFarland and how the railroad influenced the growth of the community and of those businesses. And so what I like to do, though, is to start out with kind of an early history of the railroad, explaining the background of the railroad and why it started and why it came to Wisconsin and particularly to McFarland. But the Baltimore and Ohio was the first chartered railroad in the country, and it had 13 miles of track in 1830 and went between Baltimore and Ellicott Mills. And the first train went 26 miles, 13 miles out to Ellicott Mills and 13 miles back to Baltimore. And this was the first steam locomotive in the country that transferred people. There were experiments throughout the East during the 1820s regarding steam engines, but finally the Baltimore and Ohio put some track together and got a steam engine. Before then, though, there were a few rail out there, but the cars were pulled by horses. And so in 1830, finally, we had a first steam locomotive. And so that idea of transportation started to spread rather quickly out east. And before too long, there were 800 miles of track laid in the east and in the south. And there was railroad fever all across the country, and it hit Wisconsin just as Wisconsin became a territory in 1836. And what was happening in Wisconsin that people thought the railroad would really help was the lead mining in the southwest portion of the state, because they were dragging lead out of there by wagon load, and it was slow, and they would go to the Mississippi or they took it to Milwaukee on Lake Michigan, and it was a rather tedious way of hauling the lead out. So they had this great idea that the railroad was going to be the perfect transportation mode to transport the lead. And so there were two charters offered by the territorial legislature. One was for the Dubuque Railroad and another one for LaFontaine. And the Dubuque Railroad was, of course, between the lead region and Dubuque, where they could get the lead to the Mississippi. And the LaFontaine Railroad was up by Green Bay and Lake Winnebago, and that was involved James Doty, the name that's well known in Madison. But those railroads never got started. And because in 1837 there was an economic depression that hit the entire country, and it lasted for about 6 or 7 years. So those charters that were offered to those two railroads just kind of sat there. There wasn't the financing, and so they couldn't get the ball rolling on that. But by 1843, the economy was looking better, and things were starting to look like maybe the railroads could begin working. But financing was always an issue. They just couldn't find money to build the railroads. And the lead mining business was kind of tapering off at that time, but wheat was growing. And so the wheat farmers were demanding better transportation, especially in the central part of the state around Dane County and counties surrounding it. Farmers wanted a better way to get wheat to the ports, either on the Mississippi or in Lake Michigan. And in 1847, the territorial legislature set up 4 more charters for railroads, and one included the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad. And at the last meeting of the territorial legislature in 1848, the charter was amended so that the Waukesha, or Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, could go all the way to the Mississippi. And so by 1848, so things were looking good for the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, but still there was a lack of financing. And plank roads were actually what was getting the money from the legislature. Between Watertown and Milwaukee, there was a plank road, and the farmers could put their ox wagons on the plank roads and have an easier time getting the wheat or whatever they were selling to the Milwaukee port. But financing for railroads just wasn't happening, because there was a law, or it was written in the Constitution, that the state could not finance public projects because they were afraid they'd go into debt, like some other Midwestern states had done when they would finance railroad projects. But in 1849, there was a new law passed that allowed municipalities to finance railroad projects. And this really changed the game, because Milwaukee was desperate for a railroad, because they were in competition with not only Racine and Kenosha, or Southport as it was known back then, but also Chicago. Milwaukee thought, because they're the northern city of those cities, they would have the best chance of being the big port, because the ships wouldn't have to go further south. They would go to Milwaukee, and if they could be the first to get the railroad, they would have a better chance of getting more business. And so Milwaukee was putting a lot of money into this project. And now the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, because they're going to the Mississippi, they changed their name to the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. And in September 1850, the first steam locomotive arrived in Milwaukee by ship, and they named the new locomotive the Wisconsin. And so the first track is laid in Wisconsin for 5 miles from Milwaukee to Wauwatosa. And this was in 1850 in November. And Solomon Juneau was the founder of Milwaukee back in the early 1830s. And he was quite the important person in Milwaukee for a number of years, but then he left. But the railroad executives heard that Solomon Juneau was coming back for a visit in November of 1850, and they thought, well, this would be the perfect time to test the locomotive and the tracks for those 5 miles. So they got Solomon Juneau on the train, the first train that he, of course, had ever seen, and a lot of other dignitaries, and they went to Wauwatosa and came back, and it was a big success. And so everybody was quite excited about that. And so by February, they had gotten the tracks laid all the way to Waukesha. And so on February 25th, 1851 was the first official train ride in Wisconsin. And by the end of 1851, the tracks had reached Eagle, Wisconsin, 18 miles to the southwest. And by later in 1852, it was in Whitewater in September and Milton by December 1st. And at the same time, the first locomotive manufactured in Wisconsin was added to the line, and they called that the Menominee, after the river in Milwaukee where the railroad would originate. And at this time, the cost of the railroad from Milwaukee to Milton was $19,000 per mile, quite the large sum in those days. And so the direction of the railroad going southwest from Milwaukee to Milton did not sit well with everyone, especially the people in Madison. And there was an article in the Wisconsin State Journal on November 6, 1852, and I'll just read a portion. You can read along with me. It says, when it is remembered that Milwaukee, Madison, and Prairie du Chien are about on a straight line east and west, the policy of this tapeworm road will appear more manifest, and when it is farther remembered that we were promised a nearly straight road, that our real distance from Milwaukee is only about 87 miles, and that it has so far diverged from such a line as to add full 40 miles more to the distance. Every man with an ounce of brains will at once see the reasons for any existing dissatisfaction. And so, why did the railroad go from Milwaukee to the southwest to Milton? And, lead mining might have been part of the thinking way back when they were deciding what route to take. But another reason is the man pictured here, Joseph Goodrich. He was on the board of the directors of the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, and he was a leader of Milton, Wisconsin. He actually built the Milton House. And he helped the railroad with the farm mortgage plan to help finance some of the railroad. But just looking at him, he looks like a person who got what he wanted. And he wanted the railroad to Milton. And so here's a close-up of that railroad route, and you can see how it goes down to Milton and then heads northwest to Madison. But I'll just point out a couple things here. As you can see, this is Lake Kegonsa, Lake Waubesa, and the railroad went to the west of those lakes, and it bypassed Stoughton. And this dot up here is where McFarland would eventually be. So you'd see that the railroad wasn't planned to come through this area. But because of Luke Stoughton, the railroad changed the route. Luke Stoughton heard about the train coming through, the railroad coming through, and understanding that it was going to bypass Stoughton. And he didn't like that idea. He had a little community started, and he thought, well, with a railroad, his community would grow and become more prosperous. So he offered the railroad a large plot of land on the east side of his town for a depot and rail yard. And the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad jumped at this offer because they were always looking for free things, and free land was great. So really, there might be a competition now between McFarland and Stoughton and whatnot, but we do owe our existence to Luke Stoughton. And now you can see in the darker line the new route that the railroad was going to take, stopping at Stoughton, and for some reason, instead of swinging to the west and going back up on the existing route, the railroad decided to create a completely new route, and they had to survey new land to the east of Lake Kegonsa and Lake Waubesa. And so, with a change of plans, the new route had to be surveyed in 1852. And Charles Lindsay was a 20-year-old surveyor from Vermont, and he was working on the crew. And he wrote letters home describing his adventures in Wisconsin, and he wasn't very happy when he wrote back home to his family in Vermont. One of his letters included, "They are awful here in railroading and do not manage well for their own interest. By judicious management, they could have shortened the line from Milwaukee to Madison some 12 miles from what it will now be, and all this deviation to hit some small village or somebody's small sawmill." So Charles Lindsay wasn't a fan of Luke Stoughton. And then he wrote another letter, and he said, "We have continued the line westward during the week and have gotten as far as Stoughtonville, 16 miles from here," meaning Madison. "We find a hard country between Rock River and this place. No inhabitants, scarcely but Norwegians. And they live in mud houses. The country through which we have passed is very poor, mostly uncultivated wild land, and a great many marshes." And don't we know it? Between here and Stoughton, there are a lot of marshes, and that caused some problems for the railroad as they were constructing it. But despite the surveying problems and whatnot, the railroad moved forward with great anticipation. An article in the December 28th, 1853 Wisconsin State Journal proclaims, "The cars are now running on this road as far as Stoughton, 16 miles from Madison." And so 169 years ago, the tracks are laid through this area that would become McFarland. And work on the line continued between Stoughton and Madison during the winter, late winter months and early spring, this time of year, January, February, and March. And a lot of work went into getting the land prepared for a rail line after the surveying. They had to clear the line and remove the brush and chop down trees. And they had to, what they call grub, or grubbing. That was removing the stumps and the roots of the felled trees. And it required using oxen pulling plows. So it was very hard and tedious work. And while they were doing this, the trestles were being built over the creeks and the marshes and the rivers. And while they were trying to make the grade for the rail bed, men would be using picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, horses, oxen, plows, and the men moved dirt and built up the rail bed and applied gravel, the last step in the grading process. And quite often they applied the gravel for about 2 feet deep. But while they were doing this, as Charles Lindsay said, it was very marshy, and they came across a sinkhole between Stoughton and McFarland, or this area. And the sinkhole was just not taking. They would dump as much gravel and dirt into this sinkhole as possible, and they'd lay the tracks over it, and they'd come the next morning and find the tracks just hanging over water. Everything had sunk. And so the railroad had recruited some homesteaders in that area to cut timber. And so they cut a lot of timber and put it into the sinkhole and tried to build up the track. And again, the next day they came and all the timber had floated to Lake Egansa or had sunk. And so they just kept repeating this. And the story is that the homesteaders chopped down 40 acres of wood. I don't know if that's true, but that's a lot of timber. And this sinkhole, even though they got it covered and the railroad could go through, it gave the railroad problems for years to come. There were articles in the 1860s talking about the problems with the sinkhole, and the trains couldn't get over the marsh because of the sinkhole until they could refill it again. So it was a continuous problem. Well, I should go back. But railroad was finally completed to Madison in May of 1854. And the first train arrived on May 18th, 1854. And on May 23rd, there was a huge celebration for the train coming from Milwaukee and arriving in Madison. All the dignitaries from Milwaukee were on the train, and there was this huge celebration on the Capitol Square. They had a ginormous picnic for everybody who wanted to celebrate. And there were thousands and thousands of people lining the track as it came into Madison across Lake Monona and stopped at the depot on West Washington. But between Stoughton and Madison, it was 16 miles and kind of a long distance that the railroad didn't like to have that far of a distance without a depot or a station. And so at some time, there's a depot called the Door Creek Station. And where exactly this was located, I think could be up for debate, even though in one reference it pinpoints it pretty exactly, but I'm not 100% sure about it. In the History of Madison and Dane County, published in 1877, it says that a Door Creek Station, a small depot with a side track, was erected in 1855. The location was Section 2 of the town of Dunn, the northeast quarter of the southeast quarter, which would put it right where Highway AB, or the tracks cross Highway AB, just on this side of AB. That's where the depot was located, according to this History of Madison and Dane County. Another source, the Steam and Cinders, the Advent of Railroads in Wisconsin, said the Door Creek Station was halfway between Stoughton and Madison, 8 miles to both places. And so it'd be interesting to find out exactly where 8 miles is from the Madison Depot and 8 miles from the Stoughton Depot. And I feel like the location that they state in the History of Madison, Dane County, in Section 2 is a little closer to Madison than it is to Stoughton. So I don't know if it's equally 8 miles in either direction. And so I do have a theory, but I'll get to that in a second. But according to John McFarland, a stepson of William McFarland, in a February 16, 1930 article in the Capital Times, the Door Creek Station was inadequate because of a rather steep grade for trains going west. And after stopping at the depot, it was difficult for the wood-burning locomotives of that day to get going again. But if you stand on Highway AB and look towards McFarland, the grade doesn't look that steep, but maybe things have changed enough over the years that it's flatter now than it was in 1855, but that's hard to say. And then, according to Joe McFarland, William McFarland's son, he said his dad built the Door Creek Depot about 1¼ miles southeast. And this is an article from September 1962 where he says that. And he goes on to say that in 1857, the railroad decided on another location for the depot, and the Door Creek Station was moved. So we have to figure that out as well. What's the truth there? And so this is a map showing Section 2. So here's Section 2, and this is the southeast quarter, as it's said in the book, and the northeast. Well, this is Section 2, the southeast quadrant, and this would be the northeast portion of the southeast quadrant. And so saying the depot is right there. So that's possible, and that's what the sources say. But they called it the Door Creek Depot, and the Door Creek is right here, and it's a mile away from the depot. So why did they call it the Door Creek Depot? It's possible. Why didn't they call it the Dunn Depot? So that's a question in my mind too. Or is it going in the other direction a little bit? This is looking southeast towards Lake Eganza, standing on the other side of AB, and the railroad has just crossed Elvium Road, and so that's where I'm looking. And so, in the history of Madison and Dane County, they mentioned Section 2, but I'm wondering, did they misread what they were looking at? Because Section 2, but kitty corner is Section 12. Did they look at 12 and not see the 1? I don't know. And down here is the southeast quarter of Section 12, and the northeast quarter of the southeast quarter is right by the tracks, and it's right by Door Creek. So could have it been there? We don't know for sure, unless we go out there and start digging. But anyway, I think it's just an interesting theory. And maybe in Section 12, if you measure the distance, it might be 8 miles to Stoughton from there and 8 miles to Madison. A section is 1 square mile, about 640 acres. And I will just point out too, when I'll get to this in a second, but McFarland is up here, and the railroad asked Willie McFarland to buy some land in Section 3, which is right here. So he bought 160 acres, which is the northeast quarter of Section 3. And so, it's a little confusing. You get some reports saying, well, yeah, Willie McFarland built the Door Creek depot, and other reports saying the railroad built the Door Creek depot. And our stories that I've always heard, was that Willie McFarland built the depot right here, just a few yards away from where we are. So that's up for debate. And so William McFarland, it's going to be some more questions than answers when we talk about him. One thing I know for sure about William McFarland is he's an enigma. We just don't know much about him, and he's our village founder, and we would think that we would know him. But we just know a little bit, and those stories keep getting repeated and repeated, and there isn't any expansion on his background. And so it's a little confusing. And it starts out with, how old is he? We don't even know exactly the year he was born, because there are so many references that give different years. His obituary said he was born in 1817. Other sources say he was born in 1820. His gravestone says 1820, so I'll go with that. But there were other reports that said he was born in 1821 or 1822. But it was March 6th for sure, we know that. And he was born in England. I don't know if it was Liverpool or London, but it's very difficult to give precise answers with William McFarland. But one thing, as the story goes, at age 14, he left England and got a job as a steward on a cargo ship going to Charleston, South Carolina. And they were supposed to pick up a load of cotton and take it back. But when they got to Charleston, the ship captain found out that another ship had picked up that load of cotton, so there was nothing for them to do. So the ship captain dismissed the entire crew. So here's 14-year-old William McFarland from England trying to figure out what to do when he's in Charleston, South Carolina. So he figures out that somehow he's going to learn the carpenter's trade. And he works down in South Carolina for 3 years as a carpenter. But every year in the summertime, he would get sick. Being from England, he wasn't used to the hot, humid weather of Charleston, South Carolina, and he would get malaria. And he got malaria 3 times in his 3 years that he was there. And he said, well, that's enough of that. I don't care for this climate. So he went north to New York State. And in the History of Dane County, Volume 3, published in 1906, it says that William left South Carolina for New York, stating he drifted to Albany and then to Buffalo. And what does that mean? What does it mean that he's drifted? That seems a little odd. And so, and then eventually he found his way to Milwaukee, where supposedly he had a brother, and so he wanted to be with family. But just what is the timeline? And so that all seems very, out there. Who knows? And so I tried to figure this out. And so if he was born in 1820, 1834 he left England for South Carolina. 1837 he left South Carolina for New York, and then he drifted in New York. And I'm thinking that he went to Milwaukee in 1847. And so he was in New York possibly for 10 years. And what did he do in New York for 10 years? We just don't know anything about that. And did he use his carpenter skills to work or get odd jobs, or did he settle down for a while in one place or another? Or did he work as a farmhand? We just don't know. But he arrived in Milwaukee, and I'm guessing 1847. It could have been a year or two sooner. I really don't know. But, and so he worked in Milwaukee for 3 years as a carpenter. And so that's why I guess I say 1847, because the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad really started going in 1850. And so if he worked for 3 years as a carpenter, 1847 to 1850 would make sense, because then the railroad was looking for people, and that's maybe when William McFarland started working for the railroad. And he was hired to be a carpenter, and the story says that he was the first, he built the first boxcar in Wisconsin, and that's one of his claims to fame. And so he worked as a carpenter in their local shop in Milwaukee, but then he was promoted to a construction supervisor, where he went out with the railroad as it was being built to Madison, and he was a foreman, a construction foreman. So I'm guessing he was, because of his carpentry skills, he was helping build the trestles over the bridges, and he would build depots along the way. And so he was away from Milwaukee a lot. And so he found that he didn't like being away from home. He didn't like being on the road. And after 4 years, he resigned his position so he could be at home. And so I always thought, well, that must mean he has a family. And we really don't know anything about that either. We don't know exactly when he was married, or was it before he came to McFarland, or was it after? Because there are differences in the sources, so we can't get a definite answer on that. So the story is that then the railroad didn't want to lose William because he was a good worker, and so they made him this offer to buy some land between Stoughton and Madison, 160 acres, put up a depot, and you can become the depot agent and name the depot and the town after yourself. And so he thought, that's great. He would do that. And so on July 3rd, 1856, William bought 160 acres of land in the northeast quarter of Section 3 in the town of Dunn. But then you think that he moved his family here, but like I said, I don't know who that included. We know his first wife was Mary, and she was born in England, and according to Family Search online, they were married in 1862. And so that doesn't jive if he went to Milwaukee to bring his family to McFarland. And so I found some more information, but I don't know exactly if it's the right William McFarland, but I'm guessing it was. Online marriage certificate, the marriage license in Milwaukee was for William H. McFarland and a Mary Cook. The last name was very hard to read because it was all in fancy cursive. But that would make sense. His first wife's name was Mary, and so it could be Mary Cook. But then in one of these articles later, his son said that William married a Mary Robertson. And so I'm not sure what that means either. And so maybe Mary Robertson, this is one theory that I'm thinking about, maybe Mary Robertson was her maiden name, and she had a first marriage, and maybe her husband's name was Cook. And some of the things that are hard to interpret is that some people say he and Mary didn't have any children, but other sources say he might have had 3 children. And so my guess is that maybe Mary Cook had 3 children from her previous marriage. And so that's why William was going back to Milwaukee, because he wanted to be with Mary and her kids, who he considered probably his family. And so that might explain then why some of the sources say he went to Milwaukee and brought his family back. And so these are all just hypothetical thoughts. There's no definite proof on it, but we're just trying to piece together William McFarland's background. And so in this family search online, it said they had 3 children and 2 died young. And so they possibly didn't come to McFarland, or maybe they came but died before 1860, because in the 1860 census, it shows Mary and William living in McFarland, and there are no children listed under them. And so it's possible they may have been in McFarland and died, but there's no record at the cemetery, because the cemetery didn't exist in 1860. So they may have been buried elsewhere, and we just don't know. Or they may have died in Milwaukee. And the 3rd child was a daughter, and she married and went out east and was never heard of again. And so maybe she was married before 1860, and so wasn't counted in the 1860 census. And that would make sense, because Mary was older than William by about 10 years, according to some sources, and according to other sources, they were the same age. But you have to decide what's what. And I'm guessing that Mary was born in 1810, and William was 1820 or 1817, whatever. And so it's very possible Mary had a daughter who was older and would have married by the time they moved to McFarland. So anyway, this depot that you see on the left, just the corner of it, that was the first depot in McFarland. And it's possible that was the depot that was moved from Door Creek Station, but we really don't know. And this photo is 1880, showing the McFarland house in the background and the steam locomotive stopping at the depot. But McFarland was growing, and businesses were booming, and so McFarland needed a bigger depot. And so they built this second depot in 1881. And I'm guessing again, it's in pretty much the same location, but I think it would make sense that they built it next to the first depot. I doubt if they tore the first depot down while they're building the second one, because they needed a depot. They needed a place for the goods to be brought in and to be shipped out. And so on this second depot, there was quite a bit of space between the far end and the street. And so it made sense to me that the first depot was closer to the street. But the depot represented the growth in the community. There were a lot of businesses at this time. In the late 1880s, 1890s, there were about 5 general stores in the little downtown area. And there was a feed mill that was being built in the late 1890s, the farm implement business and so on. So that was all taken off, and so they needed a bigger depot to handle the supplies that were coming in and out of McFarland. And I'll just talk a little bit about some of the businesses that were influenced or depended on the railroad. And one was the livery stables, like at the top left. It was across the street from the McFarland house. And it was built by Frank Siegel Co. in the 1890s, and it was later sold to Joe McFarland. And they would transport people and various goods that had arrived on the trains. And it said that at one time Joe McFarland had 16 horses available at his livery. And it was really important during the times where they had resorts down on the lake where they needed to get from the depot to the lake, and there, of course, weren't very good roads, so they needed a buggy to take them down to Lake Wabisa or the resorts down there. And it was a very booming business. And Joe McFarland said even when the cars started coming and the resort people would drive their cars to their cottages, sometimes they would get their cars stuck in the mud down there, and they would call for Joe to come with his horses to pull the cars out. And Joe said after a while the Rockford people were afraid of getting stuck, so often they drove their cars to the depot and put them on the train to go back to Rockford. The general stores and the post office, everything that came into their stores in the 19th century arrived by rail. Everything. If something came from Madison, I suppose they brought it in by wagon, but if they wanted some items, clothing items from Chicago or whatnot for their stores, it all had to come on the train. And of course the post office, the mail was brought in and sent out by train. So it's very important. Edwards Hardware and Farm Implement was located right along the tracks. One of the buildings is still standing. It was started by Theodore and Ian Edwards in 1896, and most of the merchandise arrived by rail. There were farm implements, heavy farm implements, well pumps, wagons, buggies, water tanks, and a wide assortment of smaller tools and hardware. And at the turn of the century, during a three-year period, they sold 303 buggies. So that was a lot of inventory to bring in by rail. And also, in 1 year, they sold 60 bicycles. The feed mill is another business. We don't have a photo of that, unfortunately. But it was built sometime between 1896 and 1902. And Thomas Austin was the founder and operator of the feed mill for many years. And he was a partner in the Edwards Brothers implement business. And he purchased the flour and feed portion from them, setting up his own feed mill business along the tracks west of Exchange Street, across from the McFarland Garden Club garden and the historical marker. His wife, Tilla, was a sister of Ian and Theodore Edwards. So there was a family connection there. Tobacco merchants, the upper right, the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse. Tobacco was a huge commodity in the McFarland area. So Peter Brixton would buy tobacco from local farmers and have it sorted and whatnot in his warehouse, and then ship it out on trains to Chicago and other places further east. And so it was an important place to have the tobacco warehouse right next to the railroad tracks. And the dairy on the left there, it began in 1891 as the Edgerton Creamery Company. In the early days, the milk was picked up by the train and shipped to Chicago. And so its location by the tracks was very important too. And it was located across the tracks on Creamery Road. And it was across the tracks from the Brixton Tobacco Warehouse. And the resorts, as I mentioned earlier, was really a very important business, and the train was a very important part of the resort business. And so the cottages lining Lakes Wabisa and Kegonsa were a great attraction to the city people in Chicago and Rockford and Beloit. And so they would come up by on the railroad and spend most of the summer in their cottages. And at the peak of the resort years, 1905 to 1925, it would not be unusual for up to 10 trains to stop in McFarland on a summer's day to unload the passengers. And at some point, there were so many people using the train to get to the resorts along Lake Wabisa that the railroad set up a stop at Edwards Park to drop off the passengers. And at some time, we don't think of Edwards Park being a long distance from here, but in the early 20th century or in the 1920s, people would hop the train at the McFarland Depot and get off at Edwards Park to go to the dances at the Edwards Park Dance Pavilion. And people from Madison would hop the train there to take it out to the Edwards Park Dance Pavilion. Ice harvesting was another important business that relied completely on trains. They would, at the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, ice companies would harvest the ice off of Lake Wabisa. And they would have an ice house down by the lake, but then they had a spur track going towards the lake too, and then they would load the refrigerator cars onto the ice onto the refrigerator cars, and then they would take the cars to the depot area here and have them sit on the side tracks until a locomotive could come and take them down to outside of Chicago, where there was a big ice warehouse. Carp seining was another big business during the 1920s and 1930s. The carp were netted and taken by truck to the McFarland Depot and put into water tanks on freight cars, and then an express train would pick them up to take them to New York City, because carp was a delicacy in fancy New York restaurants. And on the menus, it would be listed as Madison carp. And then Badger Petroleum started in 1929 by Arnold Larson, and his business grew into the largest employer in McFarland and becoming a major oil and fuel distributor for south central Wisconsin. And so tank cars would be set on the side tracks and next to Badger Petroleum to deliver petroleum to Arnold's business. And then the tank farms, they started to be built in 1955, but they never would have been built in that location if there hadn't been rail access. And without the tank farms and tax base, McFarland never would have been able to build a high school in 1962. And so the railroad played an important part in that eventually. And today it still continues to serve companies in the tank farm area. So there are three areas that were really vital to McFarland's growth, and the railroad played an important role in them. And so I'm highlighting those. Wheat was just a huge commodity in this area. And by 1854, right when the railroad was coming through, Wisconsin farmers were having successful wheat harvests, and the price was growing every year. And by 1860, Wisconsin was the second leading wheat-producing state in the country. And the railroad was the primary mode of transportation for moving the wheat to market for McFarland and Dane County farmers. In fact, within days of the railroad coming to Madison in May 1854, trains carried between 25 to 30 freight cars of Dane County wheat to Milwaukee. Of the freight carried eastward on all Wisconsin railroads from 1850 to 1870, the proportion of wheat and flour seldom fell below 3/4 of the total. In a 1962 Capital Times article written by Frank Custer, Joe McFarland, William McFarland's son, said that at the height of the wheat era, 7 to 8 cars left McFarland daily during the peak of the harvest season, each car holding 15,000 pounds of wheat. So wheat was definitely king. The new railroad allowed for opportunities to get in on the wheat market at the ground floor. And in this photo, you can see the depot on the right, but over on the left, the tall structure was the grain elevator that was built to service the wheat crops. And along with the wheat, the new community of McFarland would need a lumber yard for all the new construction and a stockyard for shipping and receiving the variety of livestock. And the people who stepped up to grab this opportunity were the Amy brothers. So there are 4 Amy brothers that came to Dane County. There was Freeman, George, Eugene, and Lawrence. And they came, all 4 of them came from western New York State. And it's a very interesting story. So part of my theory about William McFarland wandering around New York, I kind of bring the Amy brothers into that theory, because they grew up in Genesee County, New York, which is western New York, just east of Buffalo. And so William McFarland was wandering between Buffalo and Albany. And so maybe he met the Amy family. Maybe he, as part of his work, he worked on their farm. The brothers' father, Jacob, was a part-time farmer in Genesee County, and maybe he needed help. Even though he had sons, the sons were younger during the time William McFarland was there. So maybe, it's just a theory. I have nothing to prove it, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless. But for some reason, the Amy brothers came here. And why did they come here? 4 of them came here, all at the same time. I'm thinking William McFarland wrote them letters saying, boy, come here, this is going to be a great opportunity for people who want it. And I think the Amy brothers wanted an opportunity. Eugene Amy was the first one to arrive. He came to Madison in 1855 at the age of 21. And then he moved to Dunn, just outside of what would be McFarland, in the spring of 1856. And so that's before William McFarland bought this land. And so did he know something about what William McFarland was going to do? And so he wanted to come here and get on the ground floor. Again, I don't have any proof or evidence of that, but it makes sense to me. And so Eugene Amy was here early on, he was buying and selling wheat at the Door Creek Station. And he had land just north of there on either side of Highway MN, just what is now MN, just a couple miles from here. And so he was doing that, and then in 1856 he started the lumberyard in McFarland, just in time for William McFarland to buy the land and start selling lots for people to build houses and businesses. And so Eugene Amy was in the right place at the right time. Freeman Amy came a little later in 1856. He first came to McFarland, but for some reason he didn't stay. He went to Madison, and then he went to Beaver Dam, all within a matter of months. But then he came back to McFarland in 1858. And Eugene thought, okay, my brother's here, so now I can go back to New York and get married. So Eugene Amy left to go get married, and Freeman Amy took over the the lumber business and the grain business. And but Eugene Amy came back with his wife, but they didn't get back into the lumber or grain business. They started farming in the town of Dunn. But eventually, in 1872, Eugene starts a business. He becomes a merchant in downtown McFarland, and he does that until 1890. And for a number of years, he was the postmaster here. And then he retired to Madison and had a house built on Langdon Street. But all this while, Freeman Amy is running the lumber yard and the grain business. And he marries a local girl in 1865. He marries Eliza Sigelco. So two important families in McFarland's history, the Sigelcos and the Amys. But Freeman Amy decides to sell the lumber yard in 1885 to Brittingham and Hickson. And then he focuses on farming. And he had a house on Main Street, at the corner of Huff and Main Street, but he had a farm north of town. And then in 1896, he built his house where his farm is. And it's the Amy house at the end of the old Main Street, right at the corner of Main and Amy Road. And so the third brother, Lawrence, he came a little later. I'm not exactly sure what year he came here, but he got into the livestock business. And it was an important business to be in because the farmers needed to ship out their cattle or hogs or sheep, and they needed to receive more as well if they were expanding. And so the livestock yards were between the tracks and Bashford Street, and on this side of the Edwards Brothers hardware business. And William McFarland may have had some business with the livestock early on, but eventually Lawrence Amy and Philetus Hurd, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his first name properly, but Philetus Hurd were partners in the livestock industry. And it turns out that eventually Lawrence marries Philetus Hurd's daughter. And then they get out of the livestock business and leave McFarland. But I think they're in Blooming Grove most of the time after that. And then eventually the Edwards brothers take over the livestock business, and that continues until the early, maybe 19-teens, 1920. And trucks are becoming more available for transporting livestock, but also Oscar Mayer came to Madison in 1919, and so farmers didn't have to ship their livestock down to Chicago anymore. So the livestock stockyards kind of disappeared. And for the grain industry, that disappeared too by the early 1870s because of the chinch bug and the depression, and so the wheat market just fell apart. And then dairy farming was a outgrowth of that. And George never really lived in McFarland, but he was one of the early settlers of Liberty Prairie, which is just outside of Deerfield, and he was, for a number of years, ran a hotel in Deerfield. But anyway, the Amy brothers were really an important part to McFarland, and the railroad played a very big part in their livelihoods. And we have a Amy family member here tonight, Regina Lee, who's a descendant of the Amys. And the photo of Freeman Amy is from her collection. And the photo of Eugene Amy on the right is from the Madison Democrat newspaper. But this is just kind of a list of the different names of the railroad. And starting with the Milwaukee and Mississippi, that's the railroad that came through the McFarland area. And then eventually it became the Milwaukee Road. But it stayed the Milwaukee Road. And the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad is the early ancestor of the Milwaukee Road. It's the timeline includes up until the 1980s, the same company. But then all through the years, the railroads were struggling every now and then, and I don't know how many times Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy. Even in 1928, they filed for bankruptcy, but they kept going. And World War II propped them up a little bit, but after the war, things just weren't looking very good for the railroad. And during the heyday of passenger travel from 1905 to 1925, the McFarland Depot sold $900 to $1,100 a month in ticket sales. By 1954, the ticket sales were about 1/10 of that total. In 1913, about 150,000 pounds of freight each month left the McFarland Depot. And by 1954, the monthly freight total didn't quite reach 2,000 pounds. And those numbers were according to Burley Allen, the McFarland Depot agent who worked there from 1913 until he retired in 1954. And soon after that, in 1954, the Milwaukee Road was always trying to close down the McFarland Depot just because of those numbers. They just weren't sending out enough freight to warrant a depot, or they weren't selling enough tickets. And the few tickets that they would sell for kids going from McFarland to Madison just didn't cover the cost of running the depot. So eventually they tore it down in 1963, and then after that, they put up just a little lean-to type of structure for people who were waiting for the passenger train. And the last passenger train to come through McFarland was on April 30th, 1971. Oh, and there's some accidents that would happen along the way. There was one derailment that I'm aware of, and that was in 1971, April 3rd. It was just 4 weeks before the last passenger train stopped in McFarland. But it was just along Creamery Road. One of the wheels on the freight car overheated and it derailed. And luckily, we didn't have any tank cars full of hazardous chemicals. We just had automobiles. And they were coming from Detroit and heading to North Dakota when the accident happened. And a couple people have been hit by trains, but the one accident that I'll just read a little bit about was Martin Johnson, who was killed when playing a game of jumping on and off a passing train in 1904. And there's an article by Charles Sanderson. He lived in McFarland. He grew up in McFarland about the time of this accident, but he, in the 1950s and 60s, he wrote a lot of articles about the McFarland life. And so he wrote, "The village lads got into the habit in those days of jumping on and off trains as they pulled out from the station, and especially the evening 8 o'clock passenger train bound for Madison. One night, little Martin Johnson, son of the Gilbert Johnsons, who operated the village bakery and meat market, jumped on the steps of the 8 o'clock just as she was leaving. The hem of his overcoat, they say, got caught under the trap door of the vestibule just being closed by the trainman, and little Martin was hurled to the ground when he tried to jump off. When his companions reached him, he was dead. They used his overcoat as a litter and started on the trip home a couple short blocks away, but his older brother, Leuven, stopped them until he could remove such incriminating evidence as cigarette papers, Duke's mixture, matches, and the like from the pockets of the dead boy. Martin was 13. Six of his young friends acted as pallbearers at the funeral. There was no more jumping on the trains in the village for a very long time." And the other one, the Knickerbocker Ice Company, an employee of the company slipped under the wheel of a rail car, crushing his leg. And I don't know if it was down by the lake or it was when they had brought the cars up on the sidetrack here, but he was brought to the McFarland house to be seen by doctors. And Roy McFarland, the grandson of William McFarland, remembers a story told by his dad, Joe McFarland, when Joe and his friend Robert Amy as kids around 1890, looked through the living room window of the McFarland house to watch when the two doctors amputated the poor man's leg. So that's some story to think about next time you're at the McFarland House Cafe having a latte. I'm over an hour, and I'm almost done. And the last thing I was going to do was read some remembrances of people who grew up in McFarland. If you want me to do that, or if you have time, it would just be a few that I'll read. This was written by Tom McFarland, and he grew up here in the 1950s. And his remembering the train, he says, waiting for the flyer to sweep through town, the flyer didn't stop. Rather, it held out a metal arm to snatch the mail bag from the rack near the station. The telegraph still clicked back then, and I loved to watch the train master run the little round black lever to send messages. My earliest recollections include some of the last steam engines to run through McFarland on the Milwaukee Road. And Paul Berge, he grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s. He said, Saturday noon sharp, the steam train would stop at the McFarland station. The train would take us to Madison. We would run up West Washington Avenue, cut over to State Street, buy a movie ticket, and get popcorn and pop. Return to McFarland just in time for supper. Cost 20 cents for the round-trip train ride, 15 cents for the movie, and 20 cents for the popcorn and Coke. Total for a day's fun, 55 cents. We'd also go to the train station on our way to school to warm up on cold winter days in front of the pot-bellied stove. We'd watch the switching of the trains. Twice each day they would throw the mail bag on the ground from the train at high speed while simultaneously snatching the outbound mail bag on a mail catcher pole. It was always fun to see a bag open up and letters flying through the air. And Paul Peters, who grew up in the 1950s and the early 60s, the awe that consumed me as I stepped into the depot was beyond comprehension for such a youngster. The steel-wheeled baggage cart outside the freight door, the incredibly high ceilings, the old stove, the wooden benches, the creak of the floor, the barren appearance of the room, the ever-present clicking of the telegraph. Another fond memory of Burley Allen, the depot agent, and the depot was helping him put the mail pouch on a mast at the trackside for pickup. We would then go inside and wait for the train. I never really did figure out how the train picked that pouch from the mast and left a different one without stopping. And Crystal Helmke Lauken grew up in the 1930s and 40s. She said, when I was about 12 or 13, Mother took a job with the post office. Her friend Cora Thompson was postmaster then. Mother's job was to take the mail to the depot, pick up the mail, and bring it back to the post office. We girls would take turns helping her. Twice a day, morning and evening, Mother wheeled a large cart to the depot. This was the train which stopped. There was the letter sack and also parcel post. These would be thrown up onto the baggage cart, and the cart was then filled with mail sacks and packages for the villagers that we wheeled back to the post office. Then there was the mail bag for trains which didn't stop. It had to be put up on an apparatus. When the train came flying through, the mail bag was snatched from its place, and a bag of letters for the villagers was thrown out of the baggage car and onto the ground. Sometimes we had to go a rather long way to fetch it from where it had fallen. And then Pauline Larson. The depot was a very important part of McFarland life. The noon train from Chicago brought mail and freight and took passengers to Madison. We could go back home on the 5:10 evening train, which we called the puddle jumper because it was so small. It was some trains on a Sunday or late at night might not stop, but it was possible to have an unscheduled stop if you let the depot agent know in advance. At night, we would shine our light cars on the hopeful passengers, and in the daytime, we would stand and wave our arms. The train usually stopped, but occasionally someone wouldn't have gotten the message, and the train would leave you standing there with cinders in your mouth. So those are just a few of the memories of the train in McFarland for people who grew up here. But this is McFarland in the 1930s, and you can see the railroad going through. Here's the old lumber yard. And across the street was the creamery. This is the tobacco warehouse. This is the Edward Brothers farm implement and hardware store. This appears to be the stockyards, right next to the Edwards Brothers. Here's the depot, the one built in 1881. This is the first depot, which I think was located here, and when it was done being used, William McFarland had it hauled to the back of his property. This is the feed mill and the Badger Petroleum. They had a little corner gas station and their oil tanks. And the old businesses downtown, the livery stable, the Amy Farm way out here, and the Lutheran Church is right here. And so that's McFarland in the 1930s. But is there anyone here who grew up in McFarland? Have any memories of the train they want to share?
I will. My brother, when he was 17 years old, he was coming home from Luther League, and they were on Milwaukee Street here. And that when they got up to the railroad, there were 5 kids in the car, and he just had a temporary license and didn't have his driver's license yet. And the beam shined into that street light, and so they didn't see it at all, and were hit, and it just cut the front end of my dad's car off, and pieces were way down towards, down, way down anyway, about a half a mile down. And Don Scarry was in, if any of you know him, he was in the back seat, and he was the youngest one in the car, and he got out and he just took a look at it, because they sat there and the bumper kept hitting every car as it went by. The train cars, and so it was bang, 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 and then all of a sudden the train got stopped, and Don, he says, "Jesus Christ," and he ran all the way home, got in bed, didn't tell his mother. Next day, Goldie heard it on the news. And my folks were down playing cards downtown and with some friends. It was quite something.
Well, I think my uncle was in that car.
Who's your uncle?
Raskolnis.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember.
Anyway, it was, and Norm Severson was my brother.
Oh, okay.
So.
Thank you. Any other memories of the railroad growing up here?
I didn't grow up here, but the Green Lantern got its name because they used to hang a lantern with a green light on when there was a train was supposed to stop there to pick up the car.
Yeah.
So they got the name.
That's how they got their name. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And one of the story not related to the train, but Buck, who used to be Santa Claus in town, always told me that when people got off the train and were taking wagons down towards the Green Lantern and so forth, there were Indians up where the old petroleum area is there that would be have trinkets that they would be trading for. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share some McFarland memories, if you have any? Yeah.
I heard this winter, and I wonder if you could verify if it's true or not. But like the reason the Green Lantern is called the Green Lantern is because originally it was an ice house, and they would hang the Green Lantern out when they wanted the train to stop.
Yeah.
So that's
Yep.
that was kind of
So, but yeah, Terry.
Maud Hosher has to be
Well, yeah.
a memory from your and my
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
She rode the train into Madison every day during our whole childhood. She had to have been the last passenger in 71.
Probably.
She was indeed the last passenger. John and Barbara Oakes, we owned the Holscher House on Rockhead Street. And I think it was Goldie Scary that told us the story. That, of course, Maud was, she had problems in later years. She was brilliant, she was a music teacher, a school teacher, but with aging, things weren't so good. So she would go into Madison every day, as you said, and basically have bags, and she'd fill them up with essentially garbage and bring them home.
Bags every
And
day.
the Milwaukee Road wanted to cancel passenger service because there were no passengers, except for Maud. And so they could not cancel when they wanted to because Maud kept riding the train.
Yeah. Well,
And what was the Holscher family's, why were they able to, I mean, that family was wealthy.
Yes. And they pretty much, I mean, I can't speak specifically, certainly not for the family. Those that we've met have been very nice, but a lot of them had moved out of the area a long time ago. And I think Maud was difficult to deal with and somewhat abandoned by her family in those later years. That's all I can offer.
But they had some kind of influence in Madison where they could keep, I mean, because I remember that it didn't stop because of Maud.
That's right. Yeah, Maud kept the train coming.
Yeah.
Maud's sister was Marjorie, and I know that her husband was a banker in Madison. So, you know, where there's banks, there's money.
I've always wondered what influence they had.
Yeah, I really can't speak to that. But I do have a quick question, and I'm looking for a definitive answer. And it's a trivial thing, but I think we'd all be interested. Many years ago, we moved here in '76, and shortly after that, I was in an antique store and saw a map of Dane County. Maps of Dane County by townships. And there was McFarland. I would have bought it, but I didn't have any money. And it was spelled M-A-C, McFarland, which is what you had in your slot, McFarland. Mm-hmm. So tell us, how did William McFarland spell his name? M-A-C or M-C?
well, both. But I think he finally decided, or kept MCF.
Did you ever see old records, true government records or baptisms or something where his name was written? Because you can choose to spell your name however you want through the years, but you go far enough back, someone records it. On the other hand, I was thinking on the map thing, a lot of map makers like to do funny things. So that could be how that was introduced.
Yeah. But I can't say about official documents that I haven't really noticed how he spelled it, but he did go by both.
So I'm going to go to my grave not knowing.
Well,
Depend upon you, Ron.
well, I think there's somebody out here now, after hearing me talk, knowing about all of the questions about William McFarland, that you might be spurred on to do more research and to find out.
I have a question. According to the 1860 census, they didn't have any children. And Mary would have been about 50 at that time, since she was born in 1810.
Yeah.
When was Joe born, and was she the mother?
When was who born?
Joe.
Joe McFarland?
Yeah.
I can't. No, because I failed to say that William, after Mary died in 1879, actually April 1st, 1879, William married another person 6 months later, Celia Nelson, who was an immigrant from Norway, but she had 7 kids of her own from a previous marriage, and then I think William was like 23 years older than Sella, and they had 3 kids, one being Joe, and one was William Jr., but he died when he was 10 years old. So, yeah, I failed to mention that William's second wife.
He remarried.
Yes, yeah.
I think that would be a more of a common thing back then, because like most of them were like farms, and they had a lot of kids because they had, you know, that was farm life was about too, is having a lot of kids. I mean,
And they didn't have TV.
huh? And they didn't have TV yet.
But
I mean,
all of the
I know my grandmother, this is like in 1950, but my grandmother was in her late 40s when she had her last child.
sure.
So I know that's possible that, you know, there is a lot of time between the first one at age 20 and the last one at age 40, whatever. It's possible.
And all of the children of Sellers from the previous marriage, except one, they all took the McFarland name when they came to live with William. But one last quick story about Maud. Now that she was brought up, I knew I had to say something about Maud, but I wanted to keep the time short, and but since it was brought up, but Maud, you know, as you said, took the train every day. She was at the depot every day, on the train every day, and then this really snowy day came, and the train stopped, and there was no Maud, and the train people were a little concerned because it was the same crew that would stop here every day, and they knew Maud, and they got concerned, so they stopped the train and went to her house. And after she lived in the Holscher house, she did move down further across from Kahn's garage. And so the rail people went up to that house to check on Maud, and she was fine. She just, at that particular day, didn't feel like going on the train. And so I don't know if that would ever happen again, that a train crew would be concerned about a passenger and halt the train and check on her. But anyway, I took a cab ride with Maud once. I went to Madison on the train with my mom and sister. I was quite little, and Maud was on the train, of course, and we got off at the Milwaukee Road Depot, and Maud said, "Oh, well, I'll take a cab together." And so I remember just getting in the cab and being a little afraid of her, being a little boy, but those are my two stories about Maud. But anyway, I should keep it short now, so I just want to thank you all for coming, and I appreciate you being here, and I can hang around for another minute or two if you have questions, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.